Hello, BookTube. In the month of May, I'm doing a read-along with Matthew at Mayberry Book Club. He asked me to do a read-along for May, and that's rare enough. I don't usually get asked to do read-alongs. And as icing on the cake, the book he had in mind was this one. It was Brideshead Revisited, which is one of my favorite novels of the 20th century. So I said yes, of course. And I believe Matthew's video has already gone up by the time you see this video. We are splitting the book into quarters for the month. So we're reading about 80 pages each week. This is a novel that came out in America, I think, in 1945. And the action of it opens with Captain Charles Ryder in his late 30s, embittered, with his company on English soil, in the English countryside. His army company is basically doing drills and maneuvers, hoping that when they get called up, they will get shipped out to the real action in the European theater. So they're training when it comes to camp discipline and bivouacking and gas attack preparation and drilling, I assume, of one kind or another. And it's a routine life. Charles Ryder, we get the sense almost right away, is more intelligent than any of the people around him, but he sort of resigned himself to life in the army and tells us a little bit nostalgically that he's fallen out of love with the army. And it doesn't take more than a couple of pages before we see that the army is also feeling nostalgic. When we see older commanding generals, older commanding figures of one kind or another, they lose no time in bemoaning how things just aren't what they used to be. The men are slovenly, the conditions are slovenly. In other words, right from the beginning, there's an air of dissatisfaction. The men under Ryder's command, for instance, are dissatisfied with doing this basically kabuki theater camping from one district to the next, when what they really want to do is go to war. The people who in the countryside who are imposed upon by these companies are unhappy with that fact. And Ryder himself is unhappy. With the impression we get of him in the opening pages is just a desiccated, hollowed out figure, just gray on the inside and the outside. And we're not 100% sure where the whole thing is going. What kind of drama can really ensue if you're following a company around the English countryside as they bivouac and then break bivouac? And that is dispelled. That is cleared up right away when one late night, early morning, Charles Ryder realizes that they have come to a stop, that they're making a new camp, a new bivouac, setting up roads, hacking them through the forest, having depots of supplies and whatnot, the usual grubby routine of the company. And then, as an afterthought, he asks his second in command the name of the place where they happen to have fetched up this time. And the whole novel changes. And this is right at the beginning. I want to read you the bit where that happens, where we suddenly realize that Wah has something else going on here. There's something bigger in mind. I slept until my servant called me, this is Ryder, rose wearily, dressed and shaved in silence. It was not until I reached the door that I asked the second in command, "What's this place called?" He told me, and on an instant, it was as though someone had switched off the wireless, and a voice that had been bawling in my ears incessantly, fatuously, for days beyond number, had been suddenly cut short. An immense silence followed, empty at first, but gradually, as my outraged senses regained authority, full of a multitude of sweet and natural and long-forgotten sounds. For he had spoken a name that was so familiar to me, a conjurer's name of such ancient power, that at its mere sound, the phantoms of those haunted late years began to take flight. Notice that I think this is the first moment where we really see Wah's mastery as a writer. A less confident writer would have told us the name. Instead, we don't get it. We just know the effect that it has. And Ryder goes on. We've been living inside his head for 10, 15 pages by now. We've never seen anything like this before. Beyond and about us, more familiar still, lay an exquisite man-made landscape. It was a sequestered place, enclosed and embraced in a single winding valley. Our camp lay along one gentle slope, Opposite us, the ground led, still unravished, to the neighborly horizon, and between us flowed a stream. It was named the Bride, and rose not 2 miles away at a farm called Bride Springs, where we used to sometimes walk to tea. It became a considerable river lower down before it joined the Avon, which had been dammed here to form 3 lakes, one no more than a wet slate among the reeds, but the others more spacious, reflecting the clouds and the mighty beeches at their margin. The woods were all of oak and beech, the oak gray and bare, the beech faintly dusted with green by the breaking buds. They made a simple, careful design pattern with the green glades and the wide green spaces. Did the fallow deer graze here still? And, lest the eye wander aimlessly, a Doric temple stood by the water's edge, and an ivy-grown arch spanned the lowest of the connecting weirs. All this had been planned and planted half a century ago or more, so that at about this date it might be seen in its maturity. From where I stood, the house was hidden by a green spur, but I knew well how and where it lay, couched among the lime trees like a hind in the bracken. Was this the mirage? Which was the mirage? Which the palpable earth? So we get the sense right away at the beginning of the book that Ryder has, by sheer chance, in the maneuvers of his company, been brought up at a place that he knows well, a place that he has a long history with. And then the opening, that is like a prologue, and that breaks. We stop spending time with that company. We stop spending time in the present, because Ryder has been sort of nudged into remembering, and we go into his memories. We go back almost 20 years to when he was an undergraduate at Oxford, and went up from a fairly prosperous sort of upper middle class family, and at first had normal lodgings, normal friends, normal aspirations. But as he tells us in the course of the 80 pages that we're reading today, he was in search of love in those days. He was in search of the low door in the garden wall that, if you could only find it and go through, would lead you to a world that isn't glimpsed from outside, that has no window looking down on it. I believe I set that part aside to read to you. No, I don't think I did. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. It isn't long after he's at Oxford, just a term or two, when he meets a young man named Sebastian Flyte, who he notices first without meeting because he's eccentric. He's a grown boy, but he carries a teddy bear around with him, and he's beautiful. That's the first hint of the element of homoeroticism in this book that has, I think, been overplayed. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that next week, most especially, but a little bit this week. Through an inopportune moment, Charles Ryder has ground floor rooms on the quad at Oxford, and that means that people have access to his windows. And one night, after too much wine, Sebastian Flyte politely vomits inside Charles Ryder's rooms, and then feels terrible about it the next day and floods the room with flowers, buys a whole flower shop full of flowers. Charles Ryder comes back and his room is full of flowers, with a contrite note asking him to lunch. And it's that way that Charles Ryder comes to know the whole world of Sebastian Flyte at Oxford. It turns out that Sebastian Flyte is the youngest son of a nobleman and is fabulously wealthy and has a fabulous home in the countryside called Brideshead Castle. Ryder also meets Sebastian Flyte's immediate circle at school, a bunch of feckless younger sons of noblemen and moneyed members of the landed gentry, and an anomalous figure named Anthony Blanche, who is ostentatious in every way, has the put upon fashionable stutter of the time, is fond of taunting his his fellow schoolmates in a vaguely vampish way, and who went to school with Sebastian Flyte. Before they came up to Oxford together, they were at school together. So as Charles Ryder's fascination with Sebastian grows, he has a ready source of venomous gossip in Anthony Blanche, who happily there's a long scene that we get in these pages where he takes Charles Ryder to dinner and tells him everything scandalous about the Marchmain family, the Flytes, who are English Catholics and who are a notorious cause in their circles of society because Lord Marchmain, Sebastian's father, has decamped permanently to Italy, where he's living with a mistress. And Lady Marchmain, his mother, has put on the airs of a long-suffering, hair-suited saint who does good by the poor and who has, as Waugh puts it, both the voice of a saint and the power of a saint. We don't meet her in these pages. But Sebastian does bring Charles Ryder out to see the house. They have a car that they got from some other student. They take it out early enough so that student doesn't bore them with his company. Instead, they're alone together out on the roads with strawberries and wine, and they eventually, from a distance, see the enormous house. Sebastian has an errand in mind. He wants to go to the house and visit his old nanny, who still lives there, in a room above the fake dome of the main hallway. She lives up in the nurseries, where she once took care of Sebastian and his older brother, Brideshead, and his two sisters, Cordelia and Julia. The family doesn't need her to be a nanny anymore. She is sort of just living in a very cozy, quiet retirement up in those rooms. And Sebastian, we get the impression, regularly visits her, just to chat and listen to her burble. And he brings Charles along this time. Charles is very eager to see the rest of the house, but it's all shuttered and draped over. And Sebastian doesn't like the place because, as he puts it, it's where my family live. And he doesn't want to share Charles with them. He's afraid they will charm him, that they will take him away. So Sebastian says his family is always taking things away from him, and he's determined that Charles won't be one of those things. So they go back to school before any of the rest of the family shows up. And they become steadily more intimate, but then the long break comes. And as Charles Ryder puts it, Sebastian vanishes back into his other world. He appears not to think of inviting Charles into that world, and that world is very different. That world is a massive stately home, immense income, titled nobility of the country coming and going out the front and back door. Whereas Charles goes back home to his father's house. His father has been, we get the slight impression that his father has been rather catastrophically widowed. Charles's mother died in Bosnia, working for the Red Cross, and I don't think it's ever made really explicit, but it seems pretty obvious that her death was unexpected and maybe even violent, and it seems to have unseated the reason of Charles's father, who seems like a venomous person anyway. And Charles has no money. By the time he goes back home, thanks to his association with the rather high living style of Sebastian Flyte's friends, he's spent and overspent his entire allowance and doesn't have any left. He's forced to spend day after day after day in his father's house and night after night in his father's social company. And when his father realizes this, he makes a vicious game out of making Charles more and more miserable. Plays games with Charles's friends, has a ghastly social evening that he knows his son is going to hate. It's a curious portrait. It stands out. Charles Ryder's father is not a major character in the book, but I've never known anybody who didn't read this book, like, for instance, the first time. I believe Matthew is reading this book for the first time. I've never known anybody who reads this book for the first time who isn't really struck by that first of all. That's really the first major impression that the book gives them, is this kind of chilly psychological contempt that Charles Ryder's father feels for him. But it's while Charles Ryder is staying in his father's house that he gets a quick telegram from Sebastian saying, "Gravely injured, come at once." Signed, Sebastian. There's a classic arch comic moment. It really shows Charles Ryder's father as clearly as any passage in the book does, where he says, "Well, you have no medical training. You're not in holy orders. Are you hoping for a legacy? Why would you think of going? How bad can it be if he can sign his own emergency note?" All these cold reptilian things that are meant to make him seem repulsive. uh, it doesn't matter because Charles has been sort of pining to be with Sebastian this whole time, and angry that he doesn't seem like Sebastian feels the same way. You get, it's never explicitly stated, but you get the impression that Charles Ryder would like to have been invited to Brideshead for the long break or whatnot. But one way or another, an injury gives a perfect excuse, so he travels out to Brideshead and is met at the station by Julia Flight, Sebastian's sister, who's just as beautiful as he is, but different in a few ways. And I don't think I was reading these 80 pages sort of with Matthew in mind, thinking, what will the first timer make of all this? And we'll get into that. But when I was reading the passage where Julia picks up Charles Ryder at the train depot, I was searching that passage, trying to figure out if a newcomer, a first time reader, would read that passage and guess how important Julia was going to be to Charles Ryder in the future. And I don't think it's there. It's so incredibly absent that I almost wonder if maybe Waugh didn't know when he was writing it, because he never passes up an opportunity, even in these first 80 pages, to foreshadow the heck out of everything. And yet that passage is free of anything except, as he puts it, a thin bat squeak of sexuality. She brings Charles to Brideshead, and there they find Sebastian. She tells him on the way that Sebastian broke a bone in his ankle so small it doesn't even have a name. It's not a grave injury at all. That was just Sebastian wanting company, and wanting that company to be Charles and not his own sister. And she's grateful to be relieved of the sickbed duties of a whining, petulant teenager. So she disappears almost immediately. And Charles and Sebastian are left alone. The tension is gone right away because we know, and Charles knows, that Sebastian was not in any danger. He hurt his foot while tripping over a croquet wicket, so it's not like it was anything grave at all. But once Julia leaves, suddenly an interval of perfect peace opens up. There's nobody else at the house except the servants, and no one's expected for quite some time until Brideshead shows up for an official county event, an agricultural show at the house. So the two boys are alone in an absolutely opulent setting, and Charles reflects on that in a lyrical passage by Waugh. The lyrical passages have to be distrusted when it comes to him, but we'll get to that in, I think, 2 weeks. The languor of youth, how unique and quintessential it is. How quickly, how irrecoverably lost. The zest, the generous affections, the illusions, the despair, all the traditional attributes of youth, all save this, come and go with us through life. Again and again in riper years we experience under a new stimulus what we thought we'd finally left behind. The authentic impulse to action, the renewal of power and its concentration on a new object. Again and again a new truth is revealed to us in whose light all our previous knowledge must be rearranged. These things are part of life itself, but languor, the relaxation of yet unwearied sinews, the mind sequestered and self-regarding, the sun standing still in the heavens and the earth throbbing to our own pulse, that belongs to youth alone and dies with it. Perhaps in the mansions of limbo, the heroes enjoy some such compensation for the loss of the beatific vision. Perhaps the beatific vision itself has some remote kinship with this lowly experience. I, at any rate, believe myself very near heaven during those languid days at Brideshead. I think that's lovely, but I think the fact that Waugh can just theorize that of all the human experiences, only languor is connected with youth exclusively and disappears after that and never reappears. I think the fact that he could write that long about that particular sentiment about languor means that he probably never had a dog. But one way or another, they have an idyllic time together. They sample many of the wines from Brideshead cellars. They enjoy the gorgeous, endless twilight among the grounds. Charles Ryder paints and draws. He paints little cameo pieces of the wall in one of the little offices off the main terrace, and he also does some sketches, including one that he thinks well, I'll make a present of this to Lady Marchmain. And Sebastian turns on him in a way that is unconsciously echoing his own father and says, "Why would you do that? Do you know her?" And Charles Ryder has to say, "Well, no, I don't know her, of course, but I'm living in her house." And Sebastian says, "Just give it to my nanny instead." There's a tension there when it comes to his family that we're going to see up close and personal in very little time. These 80 pages end with Charles Ryder getting to know, in first blush, the rest of the Bridesheads. He's met Julia, he meets Cordelia, who's, when we meet her here, a headstrong little girl, and he meets Brideshead, the heir apparent, and Sebastian's older brother. Only, we're told, 3 years older, but he seems of another generation. He's totally not young. He is totally an old man, thoroughly encumbered with the responsibilities of managing the property, even though we're told that he wanted to be a priest, and takes the family's Catholicism more seriously than anyone else. And according to Sebastian, it makes him miserable. But religion is going to come up a lot too here. Brideshead mentions to Sebastian that he has legal papers that their father in Italy needs to sign, and Sebastian needs to explain them to him. So Sebastian has to go to Italy and invites Charles to come along. Charles mentions to him, I came out here because I thought you were injured, but I have no money. And Sebastian has thought of that. The lawyers for the family have already bought his ticket to Venice, which is where his father lives, first-class ticket with a sleeper. And Sebastian has figured out that if they exchange that for 2 third-class tickets, then Charles can go along. So that's what they do. And they make the long trip to Venice, and it is beautifully described. I want to just read this to you just to finish up here. And so we went. First by the long, cheap sea crossing to Dunkirk, sitting all night on deck under a clear sky, watching the grey dawn break over the sand dunes. Then to Paris, on wooden seats, where we drove to the Loti, had baths and shaved, lunched, which was hot and half empty, loitered sleepily among the shops, and sat long in the half-empty cafe, waiting till the time of our train. Then in the warm, dusty evening to the Gare de Lyon, to the slow train south, again the wooden seats, a carriage full of the poor visiting their families, traveling as the poor in northern countries do, with a multitude of small bundles and an air of patient submission to authority, and sailors returning from leave. We slept fitfully, jolting and stopping, changed once in the night, slept again, and awoke in an empty carriage, with pine woods passing the windows and the distant view of mountain peaks. New uniforms at the frontier, coffee and bread at the station buffet, people round us at southern grace and gaiety, on again into the plains, conifers changing to vine and olive, a change of trains at Milan, garlic sausage and bread and a flash of Orvieto brought from the trolley. The sun mounted high and the country glowed with heat. The carriage filled with peasants, ebbing and flowing at each station. The smell of garlic was overwhelming in the hot carriage. At last in the evening, we arrived at Venice. That is the overland route to Venice. That is an amazing experience. Even now, even in the present day, when everything about this would seem antiquated, it's still an amazing experience. And that is where we end our pages for today. We are ensconced in Charles Ryder's memories. We opened with his company on maneuvers, but we're not sticking with them. We're in the past now, and we will be for the bulk of the book. And that's where we're going to leave our 2 young boys for now. Is we're going to leave them on the doorstep of Italy. We'll do the next 80 pages next week. That's where we meet Lord Marchmain and his mistress, and where we encounter the first real premonitions of disaster they're hovering over the book. They aren't here yet, but they're hovering over the book in those next 80 pages. But for these 80 pages, when I was reading them, I was thinking about Matthew. I was thinking about the first-time reader of this book. And for the first time in I don't know how long, I wondered whether or not this book will survive without footnotes. I noticed right away that the first 80 pages that we're reading here, for a first-time reader, a first-time American reader who was born essentially in the 21st century, such a reader will be utterly lost. page after page after page. The moments that I read, maybe not, but most of the rest of it, all of the military experiences at the very beginning of the book, and keep in mind that's the very first impression. That's your way in to the book. All of the military impressions, all of the military descriptions are only half there. Wall loads them down with jargon, with the idiom of the day, and never tries to explain anything. Never even seems to see the need to explain anything. So you're lost, absolutely lost. If you don't know something about the command structure of a British company, a British Army company, you won't have any idea what's going on. You won't have any idea who to pay attention to, who's in trouble, and why. And just when you get over that, you then switch to Oxford of a quarter of a century before, and that too, those pages too, are absolutely crammed with idiom, with unexplained allusions, with references and argot that a total newcomer is simply not going to get. No offense to their intelligence, it's not a question of intelligence. It's almost in a foreign language. Large chunks of it are almost in a foreign language, so that you have to really hang on. You really have to hang on. Once a relationship starts to blossom between Charles Ryder and Sebastian Flyte, well, relationships are eternal. So once that starts to happen, and once you start getting introduced to the family dynamic, you're on much firmer ground. But before that, Eights Week, My Scout, what American reader in the 21st century is going to have any idea what any of that means? And I was reading it and I was asking myself, all right, well, in those situations, a company out in the field, Oxford in the 1920s, in those situations, is there anything in those pages to help the reader along? And there really isn't. I don't think there really is. I think, in a way that I was not aware of before, the opening of this book, the first, I would say maybe 25 pages out of the 80 that we're reading today, really are an obstacle course, not an invitation. They really are. Sorry, Bean is right here with me, and she's fussing. What are you doing, baby? Huh? You looking out the window? Baby, what are you doing? I'm trying to pontificate here. I'm surprised she's not right here. She's been really sticking close. So if any of you who are doing this read along with us, I guess is what I'm asking. I knew that was going to happen. What I'm asking is, I'm worried. If you're reading this book for the first time along with Matthew, were you put off by the beginning? Were you put off by the opening? And did it get better as it went along? I really don't think you have to worry about that for the rest of the book. But I was more aware this time around than ever before how inhospitable an opening to this book has. And that, as much as I hate to say it, that has to go down to authorial laziness. That doesn't exist in Waugh's other major works, not to this extent. This is just him writing it out of memory and not caring, not pausing to think that maybe this won't translate in 50 years or 100 years. Same thing is true with a lack of an authorized version. There's no authorized version of this book. So if I'm rereading a chunk of it here, and then I switch to the ebook that I have on my phone, if I'm at an appointment or I'm out and about, I will notice that the exact same passage doesn't read the same way. There'll be a sentence missing. It'll be an added sentence with some extra detail. But that's for nitpickers. The real question I have is for the very first time beginners. Did you feel welcome in this book? And again, I'm not thinking that you're going to have to worry about it for the next installment. So I'm gonna wrap this up. 30 minutes was way too long. I told myself 10, but I love talking about this book. I love talking about what Waugh is doing here in this book. So we'll reconvene next week for another 30 minutes. I'll see you then. Feel free to tell me what you think if you've been reading along, and we'll reconvene next week and talk a little more. Thank you, BookTube.